Welcome to another episode of Thoughts in History from a Centenarian with Dale Dyer. I know it's been a very long time since I published an episode, in fact since December 30th of last year, and that's because things have been especially crazy around here. I was having issues finding time to get up to Blue Ridge to do the interviews, and when I did, it was right after the holidays, and Pop was wanting me to get decorations down and put away in the attic along with a plethora of other items he wanted done while I was there, which took away from the time I had to do the interviews. And then when things were just starting to settle down and I was able to get some footage, it was taking a while to get it edited for upload to YouTube, and I was also trying to look through some old family photo albums to get pictures to use with the videos, which also took a while. And then it happened. Monday, March 15th, Dad fell and fractured a hip bone, which obviously put him in the hospital, but thankfully, by the grace of God, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. He was taken to Fannin Regional in Blue Ridge that day, but was later transported to Union General in Blairsville due to the fact that Fannin Regional didn't have any orthopedic surgeons on staff at the time. After initial surgery to put screws in the bone to hold it together while it healed, he was moved to a rehabilitation center in Hiwassee, Georgia, where he started his physical therapy. But after just a few days there, he started experiencing a lot of pain and muscle spasms, especially at night. They finally transported him back to Union General, where they did an x-ray and found that due to the age and brittleness of the ball of the hip joint, it had basically shattered, which was causing him all the pain. They of course had to do a second, more extensive surgery than the first to replace the ball of the hip joint and also the original bone itself that they had placed the screws in during the first surgery. Fortunately, they didn't have to use so much anesthesia that would require the use of a ventilator, so he made it through the second surgery just fine as well, and has since gone through the full course of rehabilitation at the facility in Hiwassee and is now residing in a brand new assisted care facility in Blue Ridge, where his kids had decided would be the best place for him since he had had a lot of spills over the last couple of years, any one of which could have taken him out completely, or at the very least put him in the hospital for an extended period of time, but fortunately didn't, that is, until this last fall. He will continue his physical and occupational therapies at this facility for the next several weeks until he is completely recovered. In the meantime, he is settling in and making friends with both residents and staff with his bubbly personality, blue eyes, and big smile. And of course, his war stories and endless history of Fannin County and the surrounding area. Which brings us to the video. Keep in mind that this was filmed way back before all this took place, and he was looking and sounding just fine then. This episode covers his implement business days that he took over and managed for his father-in-law after moving back to Blue Ridge with his wife and firstborn, Larry. Enjoy. Welcome back, everyone, to our 11th episode of Thoughts in History from a Centenarian with Dale Dyer. In our last episode, we left off with Dale having moved back with Mom, Virginia, and my brother Larry, who was just an infant at the time. They had moved back to Blue Ridge, and he had taken over or was going to go into the implement business with his father-in-law. Like I said, we left off with you having just taken over your father-in-law's implement business that he had recently started. You walked in and he walked out and left you with it, which you had never run any kind of business before in your life and had no training in business management in college, because your degree was in mechanical engineering, so it was pretty much a situation of sink or swim. Tell us a little briefly about that experience.
It was quite a change of life and activities when I took over the implement business from my father-in-law, helping him out. And the building that we were in was a pretty large building. It was a brick building, and it had a basement and a lot of storage space in it. About half, or a little over half of the main floor was a garage, a repair shop, and we did a lot of repair work for the farmers and people with trucks and cars and so forth. And well, they already had a crew sort of working in it because the business had been open for about a year and a half, and so the garage personnel and the office personnel was there except the manager. But the one thing that I encountered as I first got into it, Mr. Hampton had really run the office in a certain respect, and nothing was filed. When bills were paid, they were just thrown in boxes. So I had to get the thing sort of organized, and he had a cabinet there, but nothing had been put in the cabinet and filed. So that was a kind of a learning experience itself to get started in the business, is get it filed and kind of see what had been taking place already. It was quite a chore to take care of all the filing and records and get organized and learn about the business. Of course, this was in 1947, 2 years after the war ended, and this was a new area that I'd just moved into, my wife and I and our young son, Larry, and we was living in this house trailer that we'd established a block south of the courthouse in town here. Most of the time, I would walk to work of a morning and try to be at work by 7:30, and the employees came in around 8 o'clock, start their day. So I had to kind of get things opened up and organized, and in the summertime, our windows, we could open the windows throughout the building because we had no air conditioning or heat system, except in the wintertime we had 2 big pot-bellied stoves, one in the front of the office and one in the back where the mechanics worked. So it was a pretty large building. The building about 66 foot wide and 147 foot long, so it wasn't a small building, and it held a lot of merchandise that we were.
And they actually had like big, huge plate glass windows on the front of it, didn't they?
Yes, big glass windows that it had a good showcase area where you could put things in the building, and people driving by on 2 sides could see your merchandise and so forth.
Tell us where the building is located. It's still there.
It's on Mountain Street, a block west of the railroad on Mountain Street. The road going to Copper Hill goes right by on one side, and it's a high traffic area.
It's basically diagonally across the street from Whitener Stone.
Yes, it's right across the street from that.
But I was just trying to
That was across one street, and straight across south of us was a Ford car dealership of Western Whitfield, who was a old-time resident of Blue Ridge. He just started in the car business way back in the 30s, and during the Depression, he had later on, when I got real acquainted with him, he told me about it. Business got so bad during the Depression, they wasn't selling any cars hardly, and he was getting ready to close the business down, and somebody walked in and bought a new car from him, paid cash for it. So that's the only thing that kept him from closing the business.
Yeah. It's a building that is very similar to the Hampton Motor Company building.
Yes, it's a brick building also, but it's not near as large, and
Right.
it doesn't. I don't think it had a basement in it.
No, I don't think
so it was.
I don't know if there's anything in there anymore now.
Yes, there's electrical supply.
So it's still there?
It's still there.
I didn't know if it was still there or not.
Yes, it is.
But for our viewers, what started out as a Hampton Motor Company, the implement business that was there, like we've discussed, it's still there. What it is now is called Hampton Square, which is multi-use business. There's several businesses in there, including, I think, a restaurant now, isn't there?
It's had a lot of changes.
Yeah.
But we'll kind of cover those as we go along here.
Yeah. One of the things that I was interested in was later years in the 70s, it was rented out and used as a roller skating rink for those who remember that. Yeah.
But in the meantime, to get customers and work with the farmers particularly, because there's an implement sales building, we sold hay balers, and the hay balers would sometimes malfunction and had to go out and readjust them and so forth, and we sold a lot of tractors, but we really got into the tractor business when the little cub tractor, International Harvester cub tractor, came on the market, and it sold for $645. The $45 was the freight on the thing, getting it to our place. And we started selling them, and these farmers in this mountainous area, they weren't big farmers. They were folks that, a lot of them had worked for the Tennessee Copper Company, and the copper company fellows had to go into work at 7 o'clock and get off about 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then they'd come home and work their farms, and they all had horses that they had to use, horse-drawn equipment. We sold quite a few horse-drawn mowers and plows and different things like that. But when that cub tractor come out, they decided to try that cub, and they bought the different implements that went along with it. And one of the main pieces of equipment was a 4.5 or 5 foot side mower that would go through grass and cut heavy growth a lot better than the big tractors would do it. And
was it like a sickle type
it was
cutter?
A sickle type mower. And then it also was great for cultivating corn. So it wasn't but just a few years in operating that and selling those cub tractors, and the farmers got rid of their horse-drawn operation and didn't have to feed the horses and take care of them. So mechanical operation took over from the horse type of farming, and they used these cub tractors for 3 or 4 years and saw how good they were. And our next tractor was a Super A tractor, bigger, and the mower was a little longer, and they could pull 2 bottom plows. Just had a kind of a single disc plow that it used. It did a good job, but it didn't cover a lot of ground very fast, and so we just kept improving our tractor business. It was one of our biggest businesses. And then
let's talk about the implement business itself. It's sort of a unique business type thing for today's businesses, because I guess probably back then it wasn't that unique, but in today's standards it's probably very unique in the fact that y'all sold so many different types of things, products. You sold Pontiac cars, you sold International Harvester trucks and tractors, as we've already discussed, and equipment. But something I found out that was very surprising to me was International Harvester was also in the small appliance business. Well, I wouldn't say small, it's actually very big, I guess. Refrigerators, washers, dryers, stuff like that, that y'all actually sold at the implement business too, didn't you?
Yes, and the fact is, I've supplied my own house. I bought a stove and a refrigerator and different appliances that was made by International Harvester.
That's really surprising because I did not know that International Harvester was into appliances. I knew they were into tractor equipment. Of course, they've changed the names and over the years and everything. You can't hardly even recognize the company, but that's about all I ever knew them as farm equipment. They were big out in Kansas as far as farm equipment because your brothers all had a lot of International Harvester equipment out there, didn't they?
Yes, but one of the other main items that we did quite well with was the vehicle four-wheel drive, like a Jeep, that International Harvester put out, and it become very popular, and we sold quite a few of those. When the crisis took place where Russia was putting missiles in Cuba down below Florida, a banker from Atlanta called me up one day and says, "Have you got one of those
International Harvester Scout?"
And I says, "Yes." He says, "Can you put certain things on it?" I says, "Yes." "What did you want?" Well, he says, "I want a winch on the front, and I want a skid belly and a big searchlight on the thing. I want the thing with a heavy bumper on the front and a heavy bumper and a hitch on the back." And I says, "Well, what's the thing that you're needing it for?" He says, "If they invade our southern border in Florida and anything starts from Cuba, says, I want to get out of Atlanta as fast as I can. I want to be able to go around traffic jams and so forth. I want that thing to where it'll just about go any place." Well, I got the vehicle and got it all fixed up, and I took it down to Atlanta and to the bank where he called from, and they come out and looked at it, and it was painted red and everything, and I give him the bill for it, and he give me a cashier's check right there for it. It was quite an operation. He got exactly what he wanted. He contacted us several times after that, and we become pretty good friends.
All right, now, Pop, talk some about some of the experiences you had with the locals while running the implement store and selling the equipment and stuff, all of your farm equipment, cars, trucks, appliances, and stuff like that. Give us some stories of your experiences doing that.
It was very interesting in the business that I involved in, and I enjoyed the customers and working with them. But I will just mention just a few of them that was so interesting. And one of them was a fellow come in and wanted to buy a Super A tractor, and he didn't have the money, all of it, and he was going to have to finance part of it. And I said, "Well, I'll go up to the bank with you, and we'll talk to the banker, J.M. Eaton, and see what he says." Well, we went up there and went in, and the fellow told J.M. that he was paying so much down, but he needed to finance the rest of it, but he needed about a month and a half to make his first payment. Well, J.M. says, "Well, I'll have to think about that," and so forth. And while I was talking to J.M., the fellow walked over to the door, and I saw him motion for me. So I went over to see him at the door, and he said, "Well, anybody that can't make up his mind any quicker than that said, I don't need that tractor." So we had to go back to the office, and the customer walked out. Next time I was in the bank, the banker asked me why it left like we did. I said, "Well, you want me to tell you what the customer said?" He says, "Yeah." Well, I told him, but I don't know how well he took that. But that was typical J.M. Eaton. You went in to get something or borrow money, he wouldn't hardly ever give you a straight answer at that time. He says, "I might have to take this before the board." He never would. He was ahead of the whole thing. He could made up his mind any time, but he used that as an excuse. So that was very typical of him. And so sometime later, I'd got into selling mobile homes. And another fellow and I went together, and we flew down to South Georgia where the mobile home was built, and we bought one. When they delivered the mobile home, I had to pay $10,000. And so we come back, he and I went in to CGM and tell him that I needed to borrow $10,000 to pay for this mobile home when they delivered it. And he said, well, I've got to go before the board to see about that. And the fellow that was with me, he said, well, let's go outside. And says, well, we don't know whether we're going to get this or not. Let's go to L&J. I says, no, let's go back to the office a little bit. And we got back to the office, and I said, well, my goodness, I left my hat in JM's office. I says, before we go to L&J, and I just need to stop by and pick up my hat. Well, he just pulled up alongside, not in a parking place. He just wanted to give me time to just run in and get my hat. When I walked in, JM motioned for me to come back there, and he says, when did you say that you needed that money? And I says, well, when they delivered that trailer. He says, well, I believe we can handle that. I walked back out and sat down in the car, and I says, well, we got our money. And the fellow that was with me, he says, we what? I says, what do you think I left my hat in there for? I had to wait till JM made up his mind. But he didn't have to go before the board. He could make up his mind any time. But this is just typical of him. Oh, it just a lot of different things take place in business, and my experience is that most all of the fellows that I dealt with, I never had them sign a contract at all. It was a handshake. When we agreed upon something, it was a handshake. And unless they had to borrow money from someplace, that's the only time that we have them to sign a contract for the borrowing of the money. Another instance that happened, a father and two daughters came in, and we had a nice Pontiac on the floor, and they just fell in love with that car. And they says, can you hold this till tomorrow or the next day? I says, well, yes. They says, well, we'll give you $20 to hold the thing before somebody else comes in to buy it. Well, they come in a day or two, and we went through the transaction, and we got out on the counter, the parts counter. We stood out there, and they had all this money, and they counted it out on the counter, and we come up short, and we couldn't figure out, well, we don't understand this. And we fooled around there for a half hour, and one of us happened to think, why, it paid $20 before. That's where that $20 was. And so it just astounded us, all four of us there and discussing that thing, and didn't bring up the fact that they'd already paid $20 on that deal. Anyway, these are just some of the strange things that happen.
Tell about the chainsaw.
Okay, this was a fellow that was a woodcutter, and he was kind of a character anyway. In fact, is that he'd been in trouble and had served time for committing a crime, and but he's back, and he was a woodcutter, and he bought a chainsaw from me, and they were in the woods up near Dial and back down near the river, the Toccoa River up there, and that's where they were sawmilling at that time. And he was supposed to be making payments on this saw that I'd sold him, And he'd made one or two payments, and then he got behind on his payments. The bank called me up and says, I've got to get some money in there on that saw, borrowed money on. And so I drove up there and couldn't find the access road down to where their sawmill was down near the river. So I just got out of the car and I walked towards the sound. I could hear it working down there, and probably it was a half a mile from where the sawmill was. And I was going through the woods, and I run into their tractor. They just hooked onto a couple of logs and was pulling the logs down to the sawmill. And he stopped and asked me if I wanted to ride. And I said, sure. So I got on with him and rode there. When I pulled in, this fellow was running a carrier and sawing logs. And so I waved at him, and I just went on over and started picking up the slabs that they was cutting off and piling them on one pile, and helping the guy take the lumber that they were cutting and stacking it as they was cutting. And I kept seeing that fella looking at me every once in a while. I was running the sawmill. So at bit why he run out of logs and he had to shut the sawmill down. And he says, "You've come after that power saw, haven't you?" I says, "Well, I just wanted I needed some payments on that thing. The bank was on me for not getting those payments in there." He says, "Well, the power saw needs a new chain." And he says, "It's up to my house." He says, "You go up to the house, tell my wife to give you that power saw. You take it in and put a new chain on it and tune the thing up, and I'll be in there tomorrow to pay for it." Well, thank goodness he did what he said he did that time. But he was a pretty mean person, and I didn't know how I was going to be received to come out there to pick up that power saw, because the dealer down at E11 had sold him a power saw before I sold him one, and he didn't make his payments, and he come up and they were sawing away, and so he come in, and the power saw was sitting there, and he just picked the thing up and started walking away with it. And he says, "You know, it's probably a miracle that they didn't, some of them, take a slab and knock me down and everything." And he heard the fellow say a pretty drastic word to him as he was going out of sight with that power saw. And he said he'd never do that again. Later, he come in and bought a new International truck from me. I had a little trouble with him on that, but finally he got that thing paid for. But he'd been a pretty wild person in the woods here.
There was stories that you've told me about, and I've heard you tell, about farmers coming in there and buying equipment, and it didn't look like they had 2 pennies to their name.
That was always a strange thing. 3 farmers, or 3 brothers, back up at Wilscott, beyond Wilscott. They were truck farmers and hay farmers, and they all 3 came in, and they says they wanted to buy a tractor and several pieces of equipment. And I says, okay, and they showed me what size tractor they wanted and the equipment that they wanted, and said, give me a bill for that, or a list of it. And they got over in the corner and figured a while, and pretty soon they come back and they says, we decided to take and pay for these things right now. Well, in the meantime, from the home office in Atlanta, the sales representative that I'd give my orders to for all this equipment from time to time, he was in there fixing up some of his papers, and he could see out and hear what was going on. So they stepped up one at a time they'd figured out how much each one of them was going to pay for that equipment, tractor and equipment. So the first one stepped up. He reached in his bib and he pulled out a bunch of money, and he counted it out on the thing, and then he reached in this pocket, pulled out, put more money in, and reached in this pocket, put more money in, till he finally got his part of it up. And he stepped back, and the second one got up and did the same thing. And got all three of them, and they paid that thing off at one time there. And they were just the nicest fellows to work with. Well, I had all that cash money after they left, and I made up a deposit and went up to the bank and to make my deposit. And one of the girls that worked in the bank for a long time as clerk there, and she waited on me, and I handed her all this money. She'd hold it off to the side and count it. She says, "This is mighty musty money. They must have had this buried for quite a long while," because they, so much of the time back at that time, people, the farmers and all, didn't put money in the bank. They'd put it in a jar or something and
Mason
and
jar
hide it and
buried out in the yard or something, didn't they?
And it would get musty over a period of time.
Yeah.
And she'd say, "Who on earth did you get this from?" And I'd tell her, she'd give me a hard time bringing in all that musty money that she'd have to hold off the side while she counted it. It was so musty.
Well, let's kind of bring this segment to a close. You run the business for how many years, and when did you close it finally, before you went into the real estate business?
Well, I went into it in '47, and in the '60s, the mid-'60s, the economy had got so bad in our country that there's only 1% of the car dealers in the United States made any money that year. It got so bad, but really a turn down in the economy. And that's when one of my salesmen, Howard Thomas, and we decided that we wanted to look around and see if there wasn't some other type of business that we could get into. Well, that's another story.
Yeah, that's another story for another time, another episode. So after...
So in '64 is about, from '47 to '64, I've really run the business, around 18 years.
18 years, okay.
Approximately.
And then after you shut it down and went into the real estate business, very early days, this is about the time that I came along, I vaguely remember you having what's called the pilch business in there.
Yes, that's another story.
Yeah, but like I started to say a little while ago, the building has been used for many things over the years. As we've mentioned before briefly, it's called the Hampton Square, and it's different mixed-use type offices and stores and stuff like that in it. But back in the 70s, it was the Starlight skating rink, and I remember that well because I used to go there, and there were sure a lot of people who lived in Fannin County during that time who also went there and have fond memories of it. But anyway, with that being said, we'll bring this episode to a close, and we just want to thank you for staying here all this time and listening to some of the stories and ramblings of Dad about the experiences he had in the implement business. So again, thanks for watching. If you hadn't already, like and subscribe to our channel if you like the content, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching, everyone, and if you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like below and consider supporting our channel by clicking on the subscribe button as well. If you have any questions or suggestions for content, please leave a comment below and we will be sure to read them. And to be notified of any new uploads, turn on notifications at the upper right hand corner of your screen, and we will see you in our next episode.